Today on the Awesome Marriage Podcast, we're talking about major premarital mistakes to avoid. The big mistake we're talking about today is ignoring red flags. Dr. Kim has a lot of wisdom on this as a marriage counselor, and he has counseled engaged and married couples for the past 35 plus years, and he has written our Prep for Marriage online course. So today we're digging into the first major mistake to avoid, ignoring red flags. So, Dr. Kim, what are some red flags for engaged couples?
There's probably a lot if we really stop and think about it, and some unique to the different couples. But I think a lot of time, most couples that I work with in premarital, to some extent, I think, they hear the stories of the divorce rates and they hear all this stuff and they think they're going to be different, but they don't know that there's going to take work to do that. Yes, every couple can be different, but I think one of the red flags would be is just thinking we're going to be different, but we're not going to do, we're just going to keep loving each other and this kind of stuff. I think another thing that I see play out sometimes is if they don't have the support of the people that love them and that they love that are around them. If your family of origin, your friends, if they're against your marriage, should that be a red flag that you look at? Do they see something, especially if there's some consistency there? I think another one is because we see this play out in couples, but being unequally yoked. If you are a believer and you're dating someone or wanting to marry someone that's not, and just kind of ignoring that and thinking we won't have problems from that, I think that's a red flag that should be looked at. And I think the thing we talk about all the time, if you really haven't considered together putting God first in your marriage, then that's a red flag, because in our marriage, if God wasn't in it, we'd have crashed and burned a long time ago like that.
Yeah.
Do you see some other things, Lindsay?
Yeah. Well, I definitely affirm the ones that you said. And I agree that if we didn't have God as our foundation, I don't think we would have had enough in common, when things get really tough
Yeah.
because it really is that bedrock foundation that, if everything else seems wrong at that moment, you still have that one major thing in common. And so that is
Absolutely.
so important to us. I also think
Oh,
that
I agree.
you mentioned some family of origin issues, like the family is not supporting or not agreeing with the relationship. But I also think major issues within the family, like if there's some really confusing or difficult family dynamics, some conflicts, not that that's something that needs to take precedent over the couple, but it will impact the couple. And so I think ignoring that is a mistake. Also, not learning how to resolve conflict.
Mm.
If you have conflict with other people or issues with your friends or roommates, that will probably rear its head in marriage. And then
Yeah.
another one that I've seen a lot, and this kind of is similar to what you said at first, but just not seeking counsel, not looking to get help or to learn, and just kind of making that assumption that, you know what, we're going to be fine. We love each other. Things are good. We'll be different. So
Yeah,
those are
I think so. The rose-colored glasses thing, and we can all be there. I think we were at one time. But I do think I love that you brought up the family of origin issues, because I think a lot of times we don't even realize those or how they've affected us, and then we get into marriage and we find ourselves doing the same things that our parents did that we didn't like, or the things that bothered us. And so just being aware of that, and that your families, I think Nancy and I thought our families of origin were really very similar when we got married, and they were in some ways, but they were so different in so many ways too, and those started to crop up. And I
Yeah.
loved what you said about learning to resolve conflict. I tell couples when I teach that is probably one of the best gifts that you can give to your marriage, is to learn how to resolve conflict in a healthy way together, because you're going to have conflict. And sometimes I'll meet with couples, or couples will be in a class, and they'll say, "We've never fought. We never had a fight." And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, I know, but you will. But I don't say
Yeah.
that. But we're just different. And so just knowing that conflict isn't bad, it's how you handle it can be bad or good.
Yeah.
That you're gonna have conflict, and you learn and grow from that. So I love those thoughts. Love everything you said there. Yeah.
I think a lot of that stuff too. I mean, there's some stuff that you don't really have to address before you're married. So there's some things that you could kind of skate along. If we'll go back to the family of origin, for example, there's some things you might not realize are different until you're actually in marriage together, making decisions
Sure.
together, deciding how you spend your weekend or your holiday. A lot of that stuff, our family of origin is so ingrained in us that we don't even really see it for what it is until we have somebody else to compare that experience to. Have you seen that in
Yeah.
counseling?
Oh, yeah, I think we
Mhm.
think that, grow up in a home, we think that's normal, even though there's
Mhm.
something we don't like, and then all of a sudden you grow up and you marry somebody that grew up in another home, and they think that's normal, and all of a sudden you come together and you think, "Why you're doing this? Why do you"
Yeah.
our deal was that I use a new towel every day,
Yeah.
because my mom, that's what we get to do in my house, and so, we're married, and I'm throwing the towel in the dirty clothes after one time, and Nancy's finally goes, "You just use it one time? We used to use it 2 or 3 times and or more," and I said, "Okay, I'll do that." But, it's
Yeah.
just one of those things you don't even think about, and in stubbornness, sometimes we could make a big deal over that. Well,
Yes.
well,
Yeah.
you're wrong. What do you mean you don't have a good towel every day? We do things, simple things like that. But
Yes.
I think there's other things that we just don't realize. I had a couple one time. It was so interesting that she grew up in a home that was um, very quiet, very probably introverts, but very nice, loving home, and but it never fights or anything. And if everything was quiet, nobody thought anything was wrong. He grew up from in a home that when it was quiet, it means something getting ready to explode.
Mm.
And so they didn't really realize it about each other as they got married. And so she's quiet, enjoying everything. He's thinking, "Oh my gosh, what's she thinking
Ugh.
over there? When's it coming?" And so they come up in so many different ways of our family of origin, and they're not all bad, and they're not bad. It's just different there,
Mhm.
and so we've got to be able to how do we handle that with
Yeah.
our in a marriage, and not think something's wrong just because all of a sudden
Yeah.
we thought we were so much alike and now we're different. It's okay.
Yeah, it is okay, and it's funny because I'm thinking about your towel example. I love that example so much because that's the kind of exactly the kind of thing when you're, premarital, you would never talk about that. I don't
No.
know that, many books would have that topic come up or something like that. You just don't need to communicate to that level of detail. But once you're married, all those little things just become obvious. And it's so easy, like you said, to be like, well, I'm so sorry your family didn't let you use a towel a day. It's obviously the right thing to do.
That's
And just
right.
make it
Yeah.
into a right wrong, make it into a fight. And it's really, it does not have to go like that.
Yeah, and it was an adjustment for me. I felt like I was dirty using the towel
Yeah.
twice, but I got over that eventually.
So funny. When what you were talking about, the little things with family too, it reminds me of one of the first times that after we were married, Brian and I we might have even been engaged, but he came to a family vacation with my family. And my family of origin, our vacation every year, we just went to the same place at the same beach and we just all relaxed. We chilled really hard. We would read books on the porch, read books on the beach. That's it. We would just kind of hang around.
Yeah.
And one time he was there for the first time. He said, "Well, could we like go to dinner on a date or something?" And I said, "Go out of the house? Like, why would we do that? It's vacation. No one's ever left the house unless we all went together. We would all go in this giant family group." But it was just so funny that he would ask that. I'm like, no one's ever asked that. No one's ever
Isn't that
considered it.
funny?
I,
Yeah.
I guess we could, but just a very different expectation of what we'd be
Yeah.
doing.
It wasn't like there was a rule posted there, you
Right.
cannot go out to dinner or
Right.
something.
It was just the culture was very clear that we just hang out
That's
at the
kind of what you
house.
do, and it's your
Yeah.
normal.
It
So,
was.
and it's interesting, someone else coming into that, it's like
Yes.
they see something different, and you don't look at
Yes.
it differently until
Yeah.
someone else brings it up.
Yeah, and then I would have never known of his family vacation. They would all have a house at the beach, similar vacation. So beach vacation sounds like the same thing, but none
Uh-huh.
of them would be doing the same thing. One of us is going on a bike ride. One of us is going to jet ski. We're doing all these things. We're staying at the same house, but it's a totally different interpretation of what that
Yeah.
looks like.
Where you guys were really together and
Yes.
stayed close to the house and the
Yes.
beach. Yeah.
Yeah. Quite a lot of quality time.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what do you think are some reasons that couples don't address these red flags before they get married?
You know, I think a lot of times you get so focused on the wedding,
Mm.
and weddings are great. I love weddings, but if you put more emphasis on the wedding and you're not working on what our future marriage is going to be like,
Mhm.
then I think you miss some opportunities during that engagement period to really grow, to learn, and to really prepare yourself as you go into marriage. And
Mhm.
and so I think the couples that do premarital counseling and do some things to really work on what our marriage is going to be, what it's going to look like. They're way ahead of someone that, you get excited. I get that. You plan the
Mhm.
wedding. I get that, all that stuff. But then you haven't even thought of a thing about our marriage. And then you wake up with this person, you think, oh, now what?
Mhm.
Because it's exciting planning all that kind of stuff. And
Mhm.
girls dream of it.
Yeah.
And from, I remember one of my nieces had this board under her bed that she finally pulled out. She'd had for years, and
Oh.
she had stuff she wanted for her wedding on that board, and she'd kept, that's before a Pinterest board, and
Mhm.
so she had this actual cardboard thing under her bed like that. So
Wow.
I think the other thing is sometimes our dating relationship goes so smoothly, and so they just really haven't had things come up, and they think it's going to be that way forever.
Mhm.
And I get that, because as a guy, we're pursuing, and we do a great job of that until she says I do, and then sometimes we start pursuing other things, and don't keep as much focus on that. So the relationship and dating for a lot of couples is really good. It's exciting,
Mhm.
it's fun, there's a newness to it, all those kind of
Mhm.
things. And so um, having a smooth dating engaged relationship is great, but I think you have to prepare for the fact that someday there's going to be things we have to deal with. There's things that hurdles that life's going to come our way.
Mhm.
And I think the real dangerous one is when there's some issues, but then
Mm.
you ignore them. You just think, that's not that big a deal, and it may not. I mean, you don't
Mhm.
want to fight over every little thing, but if it's a big thing and it keeps coming up over and over, and it
Mhm.
bothers you in some way, then it probably is an issue that needs to be talked about and
Yeah.
dealt with. And can we work through this? And that's one of the values too about premarital counseling.
Mhm.
One of my goals is to help couples find those things,
Mm.
so we can deal with them, and to teach them how to deal with issues, and how to not ignore them, and that they can be resolved and move forward. But if you just keep ignoring them, they're going to come up, and the
Mhm.
longer you ignore them, if they're a big deal, probably the worse it's going to be when they finally surface.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So do you find that couples, when you help them find those, do they want help? Do they want to find them? Like, what happens when that
I
becomes
think it's yes
apparent?
and no. I think some
Mhm.
couples really are willing to, whatever it takes. If we've got something that we haven't really dealt with, we want to deal with.
Mhm.
And then I think some people don't want their bubble burst.
Mhm.
They just don't want to take the time to work on it now. Or,
Mhm.
it's kind of like, well, maybe we'll do that later. We use a Symbis assessment, which I love. Our good friend Les Parrott
Mhm.
is the one who designed that. And it just gives you opportunities to talk about some things that usually come up. Each
Mhm.
person fills it out. They put the answers together, and so we're able to talk about some differences, and what maybe some hot buttons are for one and the other, and how they
Mhm.
handle conflict and communication. And so by going through that, I think helps us refine things. And it's not always like some huge thing comes up we have to deal
Mhm.
with, but it may be, oh yeah, we don't really listen that well to each other, do we? Or we don't
Mhm.
really, yeah, we don't really solve conflict in a really good way. Yeah, we just kind of ignore it more.
Mhm.
Things like that come up, and you're able to talk about them. And I
Mhm.
think that's important. So I think once a couple gets into it, to answer your question, I think they're glad that they did.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's a little nervousness in there, and there's
Mhm.
always the fear that what if we do premarital counseling, and we find this is the wrong person? And
Yeah.
that happens sometimes. When I used to
Mhm.
teach a class, I used to teach class at the church 3 times a year, and in every class we had, at least one couple would decide not to marry. And they were big
Wow.
classes, 30, 40, 50 couples sometimes. Um, but it was really interesting. There's 2 or 3 times I can remember where one of those two people out of that couple came back like 2 or 3 years later with somebody else.
Hmm.
And I'd look out there and I think I recognize them. And they'd come up after and say, what happened and how hard that was for us. It made sense. And now
Mm.
God's brought this person in my life, and I think this is the right person. So,
Wow.
as hard as that can be, it's a lot better to have a breakup on this side of the altar than the other side of the altar. Um,
Absolutely.
and
Yes.
so I do think people can kind of fear that. But the
Mhm.
reality is, if it's really not supposed to be, if this is
Mhm.
going to be a real problem, you need to know ahead of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most
And
premarital
yeah.
counseling is not that. Most of it is growing and
Mhm.
learning and
Mhm.
planning something that's going to be great for both of you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Um, yeah, I think that I can remember feeling like being being in premarital season. It's been a long time, it's been about almost 20 years now since, we were getting engaged, but for being in that season, you just don't want to be like, you don't want to need more help or more, have more problems than other couples might. You don't want to be the one who's like, oh, we're really having to work on things already. I know for us,
Yeah.
and because we've always been more of the personalities who are willing to address things. And yet still, you don't always want to be addressing things. You don't always want to be
Hmm.
having to hash things out. And so I think for me, one thing I was really tempted to think like, oh, well, it's probably just going to be better. Once we get married, these things we're struggling with will probably just be better because we're married.
Yes.
But nothing really changes. I mean, the marriage becomes
No.
it's a covenant that you're entering into, but you're still the same two people that you were. You still have the same communication patterns and habits and bring the same baggage and expectations. And so just having the ceremony will not change how you're able to relate to each other in the practical
Yes.
ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you aren't living together beforehand,
Mhm.
which I hope couples aren't,
Mhm.
now you're with that person all the time.
Yeah.
And so those little
Yes.
problems can become bigger
Oh
problems
my
or
goodness.
escalate or new problems show up. So yeah,
For
that's
sure.
that's a really good point. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of times we do think that that things will be better once we're married. And maybe some things are. Obviously, the frustration of sex that a lot of couples
Mhm.
go through, that is a way for that to play out in marriage, which should be better for them. But there's other things that it just isn't going to get better.
Mhm.
Because you fight now doesn't mean you're not going to fight when you're
Mhm.
married, especially when you're living together all the time. I mean, you
Yeah.
learn that they put the toilet paper on wrong. They put it backwards. Why are they doing that? Or all those little things are normal, that we find somebody does something different, and that
Yes.
causes a problem.
Yeah, for me getting into once we lived together after we were married, it was like, oh, the way we would handle arguments when we were engaged was I would say, okay, I can't do this right now. I'm going to leave. But once you live in the same house, and then we would revisit it later. But I would our conflict style was such that I was the hedgehog who would run from the conflict, and he was the one
Well,
going, no, we got to
yeah,
deal it. And so
we got to do
before
it.
marriage, I would just go, okay, see you later. And sometimes it was nice, and sometimes it was not so nice. But after marriage, we're like, well, now what? Where do I go?
Yeah,
I'm stuck with
if I
you.
go to our bedroom, you're
Yeah,
there. I mean,
exactly.
I can't
Yeah.
hide from you.
Yeah, so then we're like, okay, we got to find a new way to address this.
Yeah,
And we didn't say that in those cognizant words. It just became apparent over time. We would have to deal with that. But yeah, it made it harder before because I just had assumed things would change, and then hadn't really thought through the fact that you're always there
yeah.
now.
You're always there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Whew.
yeah, and you didn't have a place to run to.
Yeah, I didn't. No.
Yeah, yeah. Like mom said, "Don't you ever think you can come back home?" I mean, she was so against divorce or things like
uh,
that, and she said, "Just so you know, that's not an option." Now, I
mhm.
think if Nancy would have gone over there because we had a fight, she'd been embraced and brought in, but not
I
me.
bet she would. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, your mom was such a boss lady. I love her stories.
yeah.
It's
She
so
was
good.
great.
Good stuff.
She was awesome.
Oh, I love that. So we've kind of talked around it, but let's just be really clear. Do the red flags just go away once you get married?
I've never seen it happen.
Mm.
I just don't think they do. I mean, could God work a miracle if you just prayed for it? Yeah, sure.
Hmm.
But I think God wants us to go through things and learn things.
Hmm.
I think the red flags get redder. I think
Mm.
once we get into a marriage situation and the things that we have ignored, it's so right in our face now,
Hmm.
like we were just talking about, you
Yeah.
can't get away from it. So I just don't think it happens.
Hmm.
They really don't. I think you've got to work through things. You've got to communicate, and really, some red flags before marriage can probably be handled by just good communication, by
Hmm.
talking through some of these family of origin things that are different, or some things like that that can really. It's not like it's rocket science to resolve these things. It's
Hmm.
just being willing to do that, because they're just. I don't think they go away. Do
Hmm.
you?
I haven't seen it. I like how
Yeah.
you said they get redder. I have seen that. I've seen where they just become more apparent.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so
We're
well
just not
then
wired that way. We can't
no
just wipe out
yeah.
our memories.
We can't, and then it's also, I mean, there is a fact, like a biblical truth that iron sharpens iron, and one of the greatest tools of sanctification is being made aware of our selfishness, and marriage is one of the
Mhm.
best tools for that. And so if God's purpose for us is our sanctification, is becoming holier and becoming refined into his image, I mean, what better way than to be challenged and made aware of our own selfishness and self-centered perspective? Marriage is amazing for that, but that does not feel
Absolutely.
good.
No, and I think we get, I remember because selfishness is always, I think we all deal with it, but I always felt I
Mm.
really dealt with selfishness. And I think you just realize that you just can't be in a relationship with someone and have it be what you want it to be or what you dreamed it to
Mhm.
be if selfishness stays in there.
Mhm.
That at some point you've got to set yourself aside and do what Jesus did, and he was a servant,
Mhm.
and that's hard sometimes.
It's hard a
But
lot of the
the
time.
results, I mean, the things that Jesus teaches work, and the things that are different than what he teaches don't work. And I think the sooner we embrace some of those, the better our lives and marriages and relationships are going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think as you're saying that, I think that a lot of times we can think that Jesus's teachings are kind of, grand, like if you turn the other cheek or, I'm blanking on a really tangible
Yeah.
example because his teachings can be very hard to put into like rubber meets the road sometimes because
Yeah.
there are things like blessed are the meek or whatever. And you're like, okay, I'll try to be meek. It's hard to put it into a tangible setting. And so we kind of tend to think, I've observed, we tend to think it's something grand or great or some kind of mission or some big act you would do, but really to apply the teachings of Jesus, to be meek or to be humble or a servant leader in marriage is really in the small details of letting go of
Hmm.
selfishness, letting go of our expectations, and letting go of thinking our way is the right way. And so it's a lot
Exactly.
smaller and more humble than we would imagine, or at least that's what I tend to see happen.
I think so, and I think the more we see ourselves, things we talk about being a team,
Hmm.
about being a servant to each other. How can I
Hmm.
help Nancy? How can I make her life better today? Is there
Hmm.
asking her if there's something I can do to help you today? Of just being kind, just
Hmm.
in those times when you're irritable and your spouse says something and you haven't barked at anybody all day, and there's your spouse and
Mm.
you want to bark at him and not. And just realizing, no, this is the person that's doing life with me. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think they you're right. We can blow those things out, but I think really it's just doing the things each day, setting aside your selfishness and focusing on your marriage and your spouse,
Hmm.
and it pays off big time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
none of us are gonna be perfect at it. You know,
Yeah.
I can still get a little bad,
So-
whatever. I didn't think of a better word, but yeah, I'm not perfect. So I
yeah.
can get irritable. I can get
Hmm.
just testy a little bit, and I can get selfish. I can think, dude, we've gone where you want to eat. The last 10 times we ate
Hmm.
out, I want to go to this place,
Hmm.
no matter what, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
but we don't. But then I probably don't. But anyway,
That's the real stuff though. It's the real
it
stuff. It
is.
really is that those little things. Cause then if you compromise there, you almost feel like, well, now it's your turn to compromise. But that's not necessarily reality. And we're always making these little compromises to try to care for each other. It's just it is that detailed when you're thinking about letting go of selfishness in marriage.
Yeah, and I think it just talking about things and willing to, if you're both making sacrifices and you're
Hmm.
both trying to serve each other,
Hmm.
it really works.
Hmm.
You know, it may be out of balance sometimes, but if that's your goal together, over
Hmm.
time, over years of marriage, it's going to make a difference.
Yeah. Yes. I love that. So if a couple has had red flags and they didn't deal with them, they got married, their red flags are redder than ever. Is there
Mm.
still hope for their marriage?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, that's why I'm a marriage counselor,
Hmm.
because if those things don't go away, and a lot of times it's not frustrating, but I hate it when a couple comes in and we talk about when the issue started, and they say, "Well, we saw this when we were dating." And now they're 5 years into marriage or 10
Hmm.
years into marriage, and they've never dealt with it. So, I think yes, they can be dealt with, but the sooner the better.
Hmm.
Don't just keep ignoring them. If you kind of ignored them before you got married, now you're married and the same issues are coming up.
Hmm.
Don't just continue to think they're going to go away or we'll just ignore them, because that just doesn't work. And so
Hmm.
the sooner you're willing to address them and say, hey, let's go talk to a counselor, or let's find a mentor couple, or let's talk to our pastor, begin to take the steps to resolve those. And plus, I think once you realize that you can resolve issues,
Hmm.
then I don't think it's so scary to face them in the future. I think
Hmm.
it's something that we all need to learn to do, and that's to
Hmm.
resolve our issues, to talk through, to listen to each other, to come to a solution that works for your marriage.
That is huge.
Yeah.
That really is because I've seen a lot of couples who they end up having a lot of areas where they just know they can't go there. There are several topics that they will just not bring up, and they can talk to someone else about them and say, "Oh yeah, we have an issue here, but don't tell us that because it's not something we talk about." And so if you know there are several hot button issues that you're not able to discuss in your marriage, I mean, you're just kind of piling them up left and right. And it, like you said, if you do learn to resolve things, that's empowering. That gives you this team like win for your marriage. And on the flip side, if
Yes.
you just know you can't talk about things, you're kind of digging yourself into a hole.
Yeah, and if there are things I can't talk to Nancy about, there puts a barrier there. I'm
Mhm.
not gonna be as trusting. I'm not gonna be as open. I'm not gonna be as
Mhm.
transparent and honest, and I'm gonna avoid that area.
Mhm.
And what I've learned, and with us and from counseling couples, there's always an answer.
Yeah.
Just don't. And avoiding it is not, because it's gonna bleed over the rest of your marriage
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
many
I
ways.
think there's going to be some resentment there.
Yep.
There's going to be some kind of bitterness. There's also going to be, I mean, that's not what you wanted when you got married. When we get
Mm-mm.
married, we have these high hopes of we want to have this best friend and have so much in common, be able to talk about anything. And if you're going in
Yeah.
the opposite direction, that's not what you hoped for. That doesn't feel good.
Yeah, I think our goal, is to go back. I think what God wants for us is what He had with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden when
Mhm.
before sin came into it. And I think
Mhm.
that's what God wants with us. He wants us to be that transparent, to be naked and unashamed with our spouse, where we are
Mhm.
transparent and open, and you trust them, each other,
Mhm.
and you put God in the center of the marriage. I mean, I think that's still the ideal that He wants.
Mhm.
Uh, but we continue, like Adam and Eve did after sin, we continue to kind of cover those areas where we're different, which they did with the fig
Mhm.
leaves, and not and be kind of push away from those things.
Mhm.
And I think that when we do that, it just doesn't give us what God has for us in a marriage.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's hard because it will take some work to, like you said, to
Hmm.
overcome these things, but that's the way to get to that vision of marriage.
Right, right. I think, yeah, if you go into marriage, and I love Disney movies, but
Mhm.
when Cinderella drives off and with the prince, and it says they lived happily ever after, you don't. If they really did, they didn't just sit in that coach for 50 years,
Yeah.
and smile at each other. They had to learn how to deal with them things and work through things, just like we do.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, for sure. So, have you seen couples who were able to work through these things after getting married, even if they did ignore them beforehand?
Yes, but I think both of them have to finally realize that there is an issue.
Mm.
If one person can bring it up, but if the other person isn't willing to deal with that with them, then it's not going to be resolved. So if you ignore things before you get into marriage, an issue comes up or there's a problem, uh, and you're both saying, "Hey, we got to work this out." Absolutely,
Mhm.
that you can work through those things. And all another thing, if you've got these rose-colored glasses, all couples have issues. All couples have problems to solve. And so, if you get in marriage and you've gotten some issues and you have problems to solve, the worst thing you can think of is, "I just married the wrong person."
Mm.
No, you just have to learn how to do life with this person, and
Mhm.
and how to resolve issues with this person, because those same issues are going to be there in the next person, next person, next person. And so, if you want to have a legacy of a good marriage, work on the one that you're in and
Mhm.
learn to resolve things there, because I believe you can, and especially
Mhm.
if you're both working at it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so if a seriously dating or an engaged couple is listening and they're realizing they have some red flags, what do they need to do today?
Get help. Reach out. Acknowledge it. Just
Mm.
maybe one of you is listening, the other hadn't been listening to it, and say, "Hey, will you listen to this podcast with me again? And then can we talk about it, or share what you learned out of the podcast?"
Mhm.
And say, "I think it's time to address those things that we've been ignoring. And these are the things that I feel I've been ignoring, or the things that you've been ignoring."
Mm.
And say, "Okay, gosh, we got 12 things on here. I think we
Mm.
need to go to premarital counseling," or, or we've got one thing. We need to go to counseling. We've got to get help. We've got to figure this out before we get married, so we don't carry this into our marriage relationship.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think too, that's a time to learn to do those kind of things. That's why engagement is supposed to be not just. I think we look at it as just a time to plan a wedding, but it really is a time for a couple to learn more about each other,
Hmm.
to grow as much as you can, to learn about things that you need to work on. I mean,
Hmm.
that's a big part of that too. And I think so many times we totally ignore that.
Hmm. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I like what you said about, go ahead and get those issues on the table together. What if they have a long list? Do they work on everything, or do they start with one thing, or how would you approach that?
I love doing a priority, doing 1 to 10. And
Hmm.
so if you've got a list of 15 things on there, prioritize them.
Hmm.
What's a 10? What's a 9? What's a 5? What's a 1? And then look at your tens and work on those first.
Hmm.
And pick one of them. You can't work on 10 things at a time. But I think if you pick the one that's the 10
Hmm.
and begin to work on that, it may resolve a lot of them that are behind
Mm.
that, just because you've learned how to resolve things. I
Yeah.
mean, some people would say work on the easy one first. I'd rather work on the hard things first. And because if you work on the easy things first, it's kind of like, well, that big one's coming.
Oh,
One
yeah.
day we're going to get to
Yeah.
that one. I'd rather deal with that one first, learn what we can from them. And I
Hmm.
think it makes that, but take those applications on the others. A lot of times it makes it much easier to resolve them.
That's a
But
great
the
point.
key is just saying we can't keep doing what we're doing.
Hmm.
This is insanity.
Yeah.
If we want this marriage we talk about and dream about, and we're going to have 7 kids, and we're going to have
Hmm.
a house in the country and all this
Hmm.
kind of stuff, if we can't get along, we're never going to get there. So we got to
Yeah.
figure this out.
That's really good. And I love too, like you mentioned, when you start working on things and you are able to find a resolution, you're going to feel so much more at peace in your relationship because you know you can
Absolutely.
tackle hard things. That's great
Absolutely.
for a marriage.
And I think too, one thing we talk about, but probably not enough, is, man, when you have those successes, celebrate it. Whatever the
Hmm.
celebration means to the two of you. If it's
Yeah.
going out to dinner, it's
Hmm.
getting ice cream, it's whatever it is, buying
Hmm.
each other a little gift,
Hmm.
whatever it is, celebrate those things, because I think that reinforces just the whole thing, that we had an
Yeah.
issue, that we resolved it, and we celebrated, and we're excited what God's doing in our marriage. That's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really cool. Yeah, you don't have to just go on to the next one on your list right
No,
away. Just,
no, celebrate.
yeah, yeah, because that's good because you could have just ignored that and let it get worse and
Yeah.
worse.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Absolutely.
so good. Well, I feel like that's really encouraging, and I'm so glad to hear these ways that couples can be not avoiding the red flags, but facing them. Do you have any final piece of advice for our listeners today?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it hits you, like we just said,
Hmm.
take that step. If you're kind of past this, and maybe you've even gotten married, and now you're realizing, oh gosh, we should have done that then. It's
Hmm.
never too late
Hmm.
to take that step and to do that. And I've just encouraged you to do that. And those of you who are seriously dating, engaged, I'd encourage you to do premarital counseling.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's so important. I think it's something that makes such a difference in the couples. In fact, one of the studies I did in seminary was with premarital counseling, what the difference it made in couples that took it and didn't take it.
Hmm.
And there was a noticeable difference in
Hmm.
the marriages of those who had premarital counseling. They were more
Hmm.
prepared. They knew how to take care, to do a lot of things. And so I think it's just so important. Plus, it's not a drudgery.
Hmm.
I remember I did a class one time, and one of the guys that was in it actually is on a local morning radio show. And I remember listening to him that morning. It was going to be a weekend deal. And they said, everybody was talking about what they're getting. He goes, well, I got to do this premarital thing. And so I talked to him some. I never told him I'd listened to anything. And then Monday's on. They go, well, how'd that go? And he goes, oh my gosh, it was great. I learned
Oh.
so much. It was so good. And so yeah, it's not drudgery. It can
Yeah.
be, it can be a lot of fun, and you learn, and you're doing it together. You're growing together,
Yeah.
and that's such a big part of marriage, anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think if you're viewing it as drudgery, it might be drudgery. But if you actually have a good
Yeah,
attitude, it's gonna go
keep your
better.
mind open. Yes, keep your
Yeah.
mind open when you get in there. And
Yes.
I knew that probably most of the when I was teaching it like that with big classes, uh, that probably at least half, maybe more of the guys were coming there because their fiance wanted them to. So I
Hmm.
always wanted to make it fun for them to do some things in the class that they would relate to and enjoy.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple guy jokes, or if we showed a movie clip of some romantic movie, I'd say something like, "How many of you wish somebody, just had a gun or was shooting
Yeah.
up or slapping somebody, hitting somebody in it?" Everybody goes, "Yes." So,
Oh,
but it is fun.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing some of that wisdom. This is going to be we've got 2 more marriage mistakes to address. And it's so good to get this stuff on the table. I'm so
Hmm.
glad that we have your wisdom to lean on here and that you've seen these things play out so many times. And for those of you listening, thank you for listening today, for sharing your time with us. If you are engaged or if you're considering marriage, please check out our Prep for Marriage course. I'm going to have a link for that in the show notes, of course. And it's an online course that Dr. Kim that we've put together with Awesome Marriage that just tackles a lot of the most important ways to prepare for marriage. And it's not drudgery.
Yes.
So don't forget that we have a place to subscribe for the podcast email. So when we reference these links we have in show notes, you can get those wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also have them delivered straight to your email. Every single week when we send out our podcast email update, you'll get those show notes, resources, and helpful application questions all in one weekly email whenever our new episode goes live. So check that out. You'll see that place to subscribe. Have a great day and do something awesome for your marriage today.